Hi everyone. In this PowerPoint, I'm going to talk very quickly about Reagan's re-election in 1984, but most of this PowerPoint will revolve around the Reagan administration's response to the AIDS crisis in America. Eric Foner says a little bit about this in the book, but there are some points I want to elaborate on further. So let's go ahead and dig in. The one main point that I want to make about the 1984 election, which Reagan was predicted to win handily, and he did. He was extremely popular running again in 84. His challenger, Democratic Senator from Minnesota, Walter Mondale, selected a Congresswoman, Geraldine Ferraro, as his vice presidential running mate. First woman to do so from either of the two major political parties, and she would be the last until Sarah Palin in 2008. So now I want to turn to the Reagan administration's response to the AIDS crisis. I lived through this as a college student, so I can vividly remember reading about when this first came to public awareness. 1981, my sophomore year in college, when the first cases of AIDS were reported. And this coincided with them being diagnosed when you had the initial beginning of understanding that this was something different. As I note here on the slide, the original term for it as a disease was GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. And this was chosen because of the early misunderstanding that the only people who were being afflicted by it were gays. But by 1982, the Center for Disease Control switched to the term AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, as understanding of the disease began to develop. Doctors, researchers realized that it was not exclusive to the gay population. And as I note here, AIDS, as you know, is a virus that can be transmitted a variety of ways: sexual contact, intravenous drug use, even through blood transfusion, which is tragically what happens to Ryan White, whom I'm going to talk about in just a couple slides. So it breaks down, weakens, and eventually completely destroys the body's immune system and leaves its victims then defenseless against other types of disease or other viruses. So the numbers of AIDS patients steadily grew. Within a couple years, there had been nearly 4,000 Americans who had died from AIDS, tens of thousands more diagnosed as infected. And in these early years, there was a lot of misunderstanding, a great deal of fear about AIDS, much of it related to anti-gay views that carried over, as I say here, from opposition to the gay rights movement of the 1970s. Couple examples of this: Anita Bryant, whom I remember seeing on television commercials for Florida orange juice. She was also a gospel singer, and in her home state of Florida, led political opposition to gay couples adopting children. She claimed that AIDS was God's punishment of the gay population, that God had brought forth this epidemic to punish gays for their sinful, wicked behavior. And this was a view that was not uncommon among Christian conservatives at the time. Another person who put forth the same concept, Jerry Falwell, an influential fundamentalist minister who had founded a very large evangelical church in Virginia and established a political action group, the Moral Majority, which had endorsed Ronald Reagan in the 1984 election and even earlier. Jerry Falwell voiced support for Anita Bryant. He made similar comments about AIDS being God's retribution on gays and what he argued was a sinful American society in general. Later life, Falwell retracted some of these views, but he was tremendously influential among Christian conservatives, and the Moral Majority, as I said, had endorsed Ronald Reagan. So the person who really puts a face on AIDS as a disease is a teenager from Indiana named Ryan White, who was only 13 years old when he was diagnosed with AIDS in 1984, and he got this through a blood transfusion. After being diagnosed, Ryan White was attending a middle school in this little town in Indiana outside Kokomo, Indiana, which is north of Indianapolis. But there was so much opposition from parents and other students. And you've got to remember, like, this is when people are still thinking you're going to get AIDS if you drink from the same faucet as somebody who has AIDS, or sit on the toilet seat that someone who has AIDS used. There were all these fears about how it could be transmitted. And there was an organized opposition, they said, composed of parents, students, even some teachers in his school, and the school district refused to allow him to come back. Eventually, Ryan White's family litigated against this, and there was a court ruling overturning the school district's ban. But Ryan was harassed by other students in the school continuously. There were shots fired in the front windows of his family's home, and they finally moved to a different school district. And this is the picture that you see Ryan at his new school, where he was welcomed by other students. So the publicity and the media attention surrounding this, I think for many Americans, this was kind of the first time they could connect a face to the disease. And Ryan White died in 1980. His funeral received a lot of media attention. Elton John had started following Ryan White's story and ended up performing at his funeral, established a foundation which still exists today to help AIDS victims. And I think what happened with Ryan White, as I know died here in 1990, really helped a lot of people overcome kind of irrational fears they had about AIDS. So how did the Reagan administration respond to this? Well, Reagan himself said nothing for years, but there was important work going on from a couple people in his administration. One guy named C. Everett Koop, who was the Attorney General, who issued the first government report on AIDS and was one of the first figures to start talking about it publicly in an informed way to try to dispel some of the fears and misperceptions that people had about the disease. Margaret Heckler, woman that you see here in this photograph with Reagan, was Secretary of Health and Human Services, worked closely with Koop, also very activist in confronting the AIDS crisis. She started speaking about this as early as 1983, and behind the scenes, she and Koop persuaded Reagan to increase federal funding for AIDS research and education, and that was critically important. It's not until 1985 when Reagan learned that a friend of his, the actor Rock Hudson, had the disease, that Reagan finally said something about AIDS. As I note on the slide, Reagan at first thought that Rock Hudson had cancer, but learned actually from a journalist that Hudson had been diagnosed with AIDS, and that led to Reagan's first comments about it as president. So you hear frequently, and in fact, I mentioned Elton John a couple slides ago. I've seen interviews with him where he still says, well, the Reagan administration did nothing about the AIDS crisis. And that's simply not true. There was a much critically important work done by people in Reagan's administration. But I think where one can legitimately fault Ronald Reagan is his failure as president to use the position, the power, and the attention of the presidency as kind of a bully pulpit to draw attention to this and to dispel a lot of the misperceptions that were circulating about AIDS as a disease, and just generally speak out about this as an epidemic and as a national crisis, which it was, and something that Americans should be informed about and respond to collectively. It's clear that Reagan's hesitancy to speak about this as an issue was related to his desire not to offend his support from the moral majority. And then you had influential religious leaders. Jerry Falwell was just one example of many conservative Christian ministers in this era who were describing, as I mentioned, AIDS as God's punishment on a wicked segment of the population. Reagan could have easily responded to that, but he didn't. And this is driven by his fear of not wanting to alienate voting support from that very influential bloc of voters. So it's one of the failings of Reagan as a domestic president. So eventually he does talk about AIDS, but most of the early important work were done by people in his administration during these initial years when Reagan at first remained silent about AIDS as an issue facing the United States.